Welcome guys to another episode with the Doomed Hell. Today is about Intel 11th Gen at CES 2021. Now the reason why I haven't talked about AMD yet is because AMD has not said anything about their desktop processors at CES 2021. We were at least expecting Threadripper 5000, but seeing as though they haven't released any news about it, seems as though it's going to be very rough for us workstation boys. Now, because of that, I also think that my skepticism over Threadripper 5000 is actually, increasing. As originally I thought it was going to be on XTR4 socket, but it seems as though because they're not really releasing any news, XTR4 may become irrelevant in AMD's eyes, and they might have to release a new socket, which means more cost for the consumers. Let's talk about Intel for a bit. Intel has had a tick-tock architecture model approach starting with Merom all the way in 2006, and this was a architecture model that they had used for a very long time. They basically split up their R&D team with lithography and optimization processes and basic IPC gains, and this was very efficient as it allowed for very interesting architectures. It was also very easy to increment every architecture, allowing for a better customer basis for Intel, repeat buyers per year, and it was a very efficient way for them to make profit while also creating better and better products. However, when Skylake had come out, we did not know this, but it was going to be a TOC architecture that was going to last for a very long time. Skylake has come out 4 years ago, and it was supposed to be a TOC architecture for the 14 nanometer lithography. It was quite a bit more powerful than Broadwell. It also boasted better clock speeds, as Broadwell was a bit of a failure in terms of clock speed. So, because of the complexity of 10 nanometer, Intel's R&D had to release better 14 nanometer performance scaling cores, causing for Kaby Lake. Well, you see, Kaby Lake was a bit of a, they were optimizing for clock speed. Then, when they created Coffee Lake, they had optimized it even more, and they also allowed for more cores on their architecture, on their consumer-based architecture, which was very interesting. Then finally, the 10900K was Intel's first 10-core gaming chip, and it was hard to beat, but it also had a lot of flaws. It is a chip that is known to hit over 300 watts of power draw, which is absolutely incredible. It's just as much as the, it's a bit less than the 10988XE, but that is a 18-core processor. So it was a very beastly processor, but it was also pushing the limit on Skylake's, inherent architecture. Now, Rocket Lake is finally Intel's new TOC architecture, as it boasts significant IPC gains over Skylake derivatives such as Comet Lake, but due to it being in 14 nanometers, the cores are much larger than Skylake, causing them to not allow a 10-core consumer chip as we had about a year ago and a half. And so, this has been a long time waiting, so long that Apple has lost interest with Intel, but it was also something that is bittersweet. We waited for so long, and now that it's here, or almost here, it's feeling a bit like we have regret. Now, however, the lineup has made a lot of issues, a lot of confusing issues. My main issue is the Core I naming scheme. It's much more confusing than before. So previously, a long time ago, we had i3, i5, i7, and that was made to derive the amount of cores that you had for each processor. Then you had your first number, which was based off of the relative performance of your processor. So for instance, an i5 650 is less powerful than a i5 750. And then finally, you had K, which was to know if a processor had an unlock multiplier or not. Yes, you did have BCLK overclocking back then, and you could overclock some of your processors or most of your processors using BCLK, but the K feature was pretty much a new feature, and it was very interesting to see on their original Intel i processors. Then finally they released with the extreme overclocking processors, which were on the LGA 1366 platform. And these were all i7s, as they had all the same amount of cores, except for the very high end on the 970, 980, and 990X processors. Now, the X at that point stood for a higher bin processor, or a extreme processor. This was the highest spec Intel Core processor that was also made for some gaming tasks, but also some workbench tasks. It had basically a dual role in Intel's architecture. After that, they decided to change the naming scheme a little bit with Sandy Bridge. They basically added the 1000 naming scheme, and this meant that now you could tell which generation of Core i processor that you would have. And they also made it so that the extreme processors, the workbench processors, or also known as the HEDT processors, were one generation up from the regular Sandy Bridge processors, which meant that basically you had a bit of a confusing path, as an i7-3820 would be thought to be a Ivy Bridge processor, when in reality it's just a Sandy Bridge E processor, which is slightly modified Sandy Bridge processor, allowing for more cores, more cache, things like that. After that, they kind of changed the naming scheme a little bit in terms of relative performance numbers. They basically made it so that they'd have one or two Extreme Edition processors, and some of them would be, better binned. Others were just high spec processors, which is a little confusing, such as the 3960X versus the 3970X. And then later on, they changed that again. They just said the higher spec processor, which actually had the most amount of cores, meaning that if you wanted a high bin, it wasn't necessarily in your best interest to buy the extreme processors anymore. So what happened next? Well, they added the Core i9 processors, which were limited to the HEDTs at this point. Basically, they were pushing more and more cores on their HEDTs in extreme lineup, and so they decided to add the i9 derivative, meaning that you have more than a certain amount of cores. At the time it was 6. They later went to 8 and then 10, and it made a bit of sense, but they also kept the X in the naming scheme. Every single Extreme Edition processor has an X to their derivative scheme, so that basically meant that you couldn't bin your processors anymore. Very, very confusing. Now, afterwards, they decided to go with the even more confusing i9-9900K, which was actually eating out its own processors, the i9-9900X, being on a completely different platform, and they had very different specs as well, although being relatively similar in terms of performance. And so it became even more confusing. It became kind of a clusterfuck. Then they started adding KS, KF, and regular K. And this was even more confusing, as the K and KS are basically the same. And then the K and KF, or KS versus KF, the KF was very different, and because it didn't have any video component on the die, this meant that it could overclock better with lower voltages, and it was a much better die for overclocking. And then afterwards, they decided to release the 10th gen. 10th gen is a little confusing because, again, you have the 10900K and then you have the 10900X. But what's even more confusing with 10th gen is that you have the 10900K and the 10850K, which are basically the same processors. And when they first released, they were actually the same processors. The 10850K was basically a no-bin 10900K. The 10900K was a high bin 10850K, but they only figured that out much later. So when the 10850K had come out, basically people could only agree to sell to buy that one. Reviewers and benchmarkers alike thought that that one was the better chip, and they thought that it would overclock just as well as a 10900K, when in reality there's only a very small margin of people with a 10850K that would actually be able to overclock to a 10900K due to a lot of the chips being lower binned and needing more voltage to do so. So that was a whole fiasco. Now we have another fiasco. Finally, the i7 naming scheme utterly doesn't mean anything anymore. So now originally when the i7 naming scheme came out meant that it was the ultimate core processors, and with the addition of the X meant that you had the highest binned or the highest spec'd, well, or both processor. So it was a very useful naming scheme. It was very easy to understand. But now the i7 only has one single chip that actually has this naming scheme on the desktop processors, and that is the i7 11700K, if I'm not mistaken. And so before it was a little more understanding. You see, on the 10th gen you had the i7 10700K, which was an 8-core part, and it was basically the lower end, or the slightly lower end desktop chip, and it competed against directly the 3700 and 3800X. While overclocking better, it made sense. It was the i7, right? i7 versus Ryzen 7, right? But now that we don't have a 10-core chip, and we're left with only the 8-core chip, it seems as though Intel had decided to drop down its binning. So the new i7 11700K is literally just last year's 10850K in terms of relative performance versus the i9 11900K. That means that the 11700K is just a lower binned 11900K, which is extremely confusing, but also it means that it's the same die. And i7 and i9 has no differentiation anymore. What's the difference? It's just better binned. The i9's better binned. That's all it is. And so it becomes very confusing. It seems as though the 11700K might actually be either the best chip in the lineup in terms of price to performance, or it might fall under the completely forgettable due to everyone buying the 11900K, and the 11700K might just be a paper release, which would really suck, as the i7 has a very large history being the ultimate Intel chip. And so I'm utterly confused. Intel went from having almost all of its processors being i7s to switching to most of its processors being i9s, and having a small amount of processors being i7s, which still made some sense because they were consumer chips. And then they went from that to having a single i7 chip and only i9 chips. Basically, they have a single black sheep, and this is really it's confusing. That's really what it is. Hopefully the 11700K won't be pushing too much wattage out of the motherboard, because I am hoping it to overclock very well. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll talk to you guys later.